Our instincts are to point people to the love of God, our security in Christ when we're going through suffering. And that's not a wrong instinct. I think what Job points us to is two things. Now, one, the Lord's response to Job is specific to Job. So that's not all the Bible has to say about suffering. You know, think of 2 Corinthians 1. The angle that Paul brings on suffering there is that we comfort those who are suffering with the comfort we have received from the Father of all comforts. There is a emphasis there on comforting, coming alongside, mourning with those who mourn, like we talked about yesterday. But the challenge that we see in Job has begun to go beyond grief to drawing conclusions about the world and about God and his government of the world. And in that context, God speaks to Job what Job needs to hear, which is, you do not have enough information to draw those conclusions. And that's a hard thing to know when you're counseling someone and caring for someone. At what point do I need to speak those kinds of words? Just in my own personal pastoral experience, I have never had to rebuke someone as directly as God does. And that sort of, now, that's the Lord. He knows exactly what's needed. What has been helpful for me, having that as a category, is in talking to someone to say something like this. I know, as I'm trying to care for them, they need to know my love and compassion, and then say something like this. I know there's going to be a temptation to draw conclusions about the Lord. And remember, we don't know enough to draw conclusions about what God is doing, why this has happened. What we can stand firm on is that we know the love of God and the goodness of God and the sovereignty of God as displayed in the cross of Jesus Christ. And in my own experience, that's been the place where I haven't counseled someone who's made settled, hard conclusions and needs to be rebuked as the Lord does to Job. But having that as a category, that because I know my own heart has been tempted to do that I begin in the midst of suffering, in the midst of grief, I begin to then pass judgment on God. And that's the correction that God brings, is when I'm doing that, I am concluding that I have more wisdom than the Lord, or that my ability to run the universe would be better than God's ability. And that's what those speeches of Job, especially the Lord to Job, especially critique. And that helps. That's just a category to have in our minds. To care for someone well in suffering, we need to be aware of all the different ways that the Bible speaks about suffering, so that we don't quickly rebuke someone who is simply grieving and in the first stages, or that we don't refuse to speak to someone who is beginning to pass judgments on the Lord and beginning to go in a direction that will take their heart in a path towards hardness and distance from the Lord. That is exactly what Job has begun to do. And it's one of the ways that the length of the dialogue helps us grow wise in how to care for suffering people, because the longer suffering goes on, the more those kinds of temptations are going to arise in people's hearts. And the more we need to have as a category, even just to gently ask someone, I know this has been a long road. Are you tempted to think God is against you, or to think that God has messed up, made a mistake? What I find with Christians is that often we're ashamed to admit that we have those thoughts, but you can almost bet money on it. The longer suffering goes on, the more certain it is we're going to be tempted with those kinds of thoughts. So just to say, even if you can, because I know I've had those thoughts, to be able to say to someone, I've gone through suffering and I've drawn those kind of conclusions about God. I know you're probably having those thoughts. Tell me what you're thinking. Just to break down the sense of shame or embarrassment to admit I'm not responding perfectly in my heart. I'm thinking things that I wouldn't say in a Sunday morning fellowship time at church. And to just help someone to be able to speak those words, and then often just by acknowledging them, they'll know, I'm wrong to say this. I'm tempted to think this. I know it's not right. I just need to tell someone that these are the kind of thoughts I'm having about concluding that the Lord's not good, that he has made a mistake, his wisdom, he's missed something here. Just to say it becomes often, for a genuine believer, an opportunity for confession. And I've never had to strongly correct someone in those kind of, it's more, I'm not surprised that you think those thoughts. The Lord does not hold our sins against us. Let's confess our faith in him again, and just help them. One of the ways the enemy isolates us is by tempting you to think, no other Christian thinks this way when they're suffering. Everybody else does better than you. You're the only person who has these kinds of thoughts. And you can just help believers tear those accusations of the enemy down by saying, I'm not surprised you're struggling this way. I'll say along with that, in my experience, people usually, when there's tragedy that strikes, people usually do better initially. Our instincts are to say, I don't know why this has happened. Blessed, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And we respond better in the first initial moments of a crisis than, say, if it's a long crisis, a month in or 2 months in. In other words, our souls get weary, and it becomes more easy to listen to tempting voices and what the Puritan theologian John Owen called hard thoughts about God. Thoughts where we begin to think, he's not good, he's not wise, he's left me, he's abandoned me. The longer a trial goes on, the more I think those kind of temptations come up. And often it's almost like there's a spiritual adrenaline that happens in the initial moments of trial that we respond better. The Lord, I think it's the Lord's kindness. He helps us through the shock of the phone call that someone has died, or the awareness of a diagnosis of a disease. That those first moments he helps us through. As a pastor, what you need to be thinking is, okay, how do I help this person endure in this suffering if it doesn't go away right away? There's some things that it's a crisis and then we come out the other side, but there are some sufferings that are long and lengthy and perhaps never in this life fully resolved. And the longer it goes on, the more we're going to be tempted to have these kinds of thoughts. And the more Job helps us recognize one way of caring for someone is by gently helping guard them from passing judgment on God, as Job has done. There's a picture, kind of a word picture from a man named Os Guinness, who was writing a book called God in the Dark. He uses the picture of an old doors that had the heavy metal keys. You would stick the key in a big keyhole, and that's how you lock the door. But when you pulled the key out, there was a small but large enough hole in a door that you could peer through the keyhole and see what was taking place. And he talks about in some cases there were, I think he says this is more in like detective stories, imagining something happening, picturing someone who sees something take place through a keyhole. They see what appears to be a murder take place, or some kind of crime committed, and they're convinced because of that. They're looking through a small hole into a room, and they think they know what's going on, only to discover as the story unfolds that what you saw through that little hole is not the whole picture. And if you were standing on the other side of the door seeing everything that was taking place, the story would look very different, and you'd realize you'd made a wrong conclusion from what you really saw, but what was only part of the story. He says in suffering, it's like we are seeing life through that keyhole, through a very narrow window. And the temptation will be to conclude, I know what's going on. I know what's happening in that room. I am going to pass judgment on the Lord. And the fight of faith is to say, I don't know enough to know why this has happened, but I know enough to trust the Lord because he has revealed his goodness to me in the cross of Jesus Christ. And so I won't pass judgment. And part of the way we battle doubt and unbelief is not saying, I trust God because I have all my questions answered, but I trust God because he is trustworthy. And there are some things that you look at and say, I can't explain this, but God sees more than I do, and I have reason to believe that he is in control and he will make it clear in his own timing. And so I will not pass judgment. I will withhold judgment and say, Lord, you're not on trial. You have proved your goodness, and I can trust you. That's a helpful picture, I think. It's the same language that, in a different context, Paul says, we see in part. We never know the whole story. But in suffering, you will be tempted to think, I see enough to pass judgment, and the fight of faith has to be, I do not. Otherwise, we'll end up hearing the Lord's rebuke as he gives to Job. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? Do you see the picture as I see it? And until you do, then you're not in a position to pass judgment. Does that make sense? that image has been very helpful for me, that I am looking through a tiny little hole, even at the best, when I think I'm seeing the most clearly in God's plan. I'm peering it through a tiny hole at all that God is doing. And he doesn't give me, we'll see this in Ecclesiastes. One of the main messages of Ecclesiastes is God does not give you God's perspective on the world, because we're not God. He, in fact, has told us, you will never understand things the way I understand them, so that we can fear God and keep his commandments and not act as though God is the one under judgment. I will believe in you when you prove yourself to me. That's the response of unbelief. And the response of faith is to say, I don't understand, but God has demonstrated his goodness in a way that I cannot question, because while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me. Other thoughts on Job, because this is important. This is one of the most challenging and yet most pastorally relevant books in the Old Testament. I'll reference again and call your attention to the article it's somewhere in the middle of that course reader on kinds of suffering. It's Eric Ortland. It's one of the best single chapters on suffering, because he doesn't do an in-depth study of each type, but he just surveys the different ways the Bible talks about suffering and says we have to be thinking of all these categories, because it's a different thing. Job is corrected for the things he says in his suffering, but his suffering is not a chastisement for sins. But Job's kind of suffering is not the only kind of suffering in the Bible. There are clearly, like 1 Corinthians 11 or Hebrews 12 describing it, the Lord disciplines those he loves. I think in my experience, I've experienced both kinds of disciplines. The things that have been the hardest and that I would describe as seasons of suffering have not been where I see chastisement for sin. And part of the challenge, part of the reasons they become extended seasons of suffering is I go through in my heart and in my mind, Lord, I'm not aware of any sins. I'm not aware of a specific sin. One of the things Satan will do in those moments, I'm very aware of my sin. I can look around and say, I know all the reasons I fall short, but I can't see anything specific that I need to confess. I've confessed these things before the Lord. It's not a case of an unrepentant sin. It's like the layer over my heart is peeled back, and I see, yes, I am a sinner. I know that. And the temptation, the accusation of Satan will be, you're just such a terrible sinner. Of course, that's what you're going through. And those kinds of suffering, I need to hear, no, this is not. If there was a sin that the Lord was disciplining me for, he wouldn't hide it from me. If we're being chastised and we say, Lord, search me and know me, show me, and we don't receive an answer with conviction of sin, then we can at some point, after praying that genuinely, asking someone else, is there something you see in my life that I'm missing, that I need to confess? If the answer is no, then at that point we can say, I don't think this is a discipline or chastisement from the sin, because God is not the kind of God who would say, I'm going to punish you for a sin, but I'm never going to tell you what the sin is. He's not that kind of a father. When it's discipline, he makes it clear. So just to give you a personal example, recently, I think I told you guys, in this preparation, there's been a season of joy being difficult to come by, and more discouragement, more prone to having those dark thoughts. And that's not new for me. If I incline in a direction, that's what I'm tempted towards. So part of that, as I began to realize, after more than a day or two of being, in my quiet time and struggling to find joy in the ordinary gifts of life, I began asking the Lord, am I missing something? Is there something going on? And there wasn't anything that I could see other than these are the ordinary sins that I fight every day, and I'm confessing them to the Lord. So in talking with my wife, she asked me, is there anything going on? I said, I'm not aware of anything, but please tell me, do you see anything else? Is there something in what I'm saying to you as I'm describing my heart? Is there something that I'm missing that you see that is a sin that's causing this? And she said, after a while, after we talked for a bit, said, I don't think so. I don't see anything. So at that point, I think, okay, I've tried to humble myself before the Lord, bare my heart before the Lord. And when there's not a clear answer of this is a chastisement for sin, then I conclude what the Lord wants me to do now is be faithful, persevere in this season, and not keep searching my heart. Not that I say, not that I turn away from sin, but say, Lord, I don't see anything. Please convict me if there's something. What I'm going to do now is obey you and trust you for today, whether it's a dark day or a joyous day. And that kind of, that process of having someone, a spouse or a trusted friend, you can say, here's what I'm thinking. Do you see something that I'm missing? I think is one of the ways of discerning, am I suffering more in the Job-like category, a psalm of lament, or am I being chastised? And I think we can just trust that if the Lord is doing that, He'll make it clear, either through the conviction of the Holy Spirit in our own soul directly or through the words someone else speaks to us. I wouldn't want to conclude that, though, without asking someone else's input, just because I could be blind to my sin. And if it goes on as a season, then I need someone who knows me well to speak into my life and help me sort out, is there something that I'm missing? The times in my life where I look at and say, I think that was more chastisement for my sin, one of the things that makes that clear is it wasn't hard to draw the connection. Early on in ministry, one of the things that the Lord, I think, just allowed me a season of discipline for was the desire for pride and notice while I'm up front preaching or teaching or being in front of people. And I knew it was there in my heart, and I would confess it, but it was a constant battle of I want attention. I like people telling me that sermon went well. I'm comparing myself to other people. Was my message better? And there was a season of the Lord, I think, just allowing discipline. And that was different because when I pray about it, it's like, yeah, I see the sin. I'm aware. I'm confessing it to the Lord, but there's a rebuke that I'm experiencing that prevents that pride from taking root in my heart and helps me hate it and helps me see, okay, I can't, I have to fight that. Now, just because I've said that category, eventually one of the things I also had to learn is as a pastor, you never outgrow temptations to pride or desire to be noticed, especially if you're a preacher, because you're up front, you're the center of attention, and you will never have a point where you have no desire for people to encourage you to say, that was a really good sermon. You'll never get past that. That's part of our fallen hearts. What I've learned to do now is rather than thinking, I'm not ready to preach until I've completely gotten rid of that sin, is simply to say, Lord, you see it. You know that desire is also there. But that's not the only desire. Because of the Holy Spirit, I want to care for the people of God. I want your word to bear fruit. So I'll intentionally say, Lord, this is the desire I identify with. This is what I want to be my heart. Forgive me for this, cleanse me from that, and then trust the blood of Christ and get up and preach. So that season was a season of chastisement that it was fairly clear. It didn't take a lot of, I didn't have to fast for days on end and pray. It was pretty obvious. Yep, that sin's in my heart, and the Lord is reminding me that that's an ugly sin. And other seasons, the confusion comes from, Lord, I don't see anything like that. And then you ask someone else, ask for input. And if no one is saying, yeah, here's a sin that I think you're not seeing, then trust the Lord that He's allowed this for a reason that He hasn't told me. And then do what's in front of you. Obey and trust the Lord. Does that answer the question? Again, having those different categories for suffering so that we don't treat everything the same way. There's an American saying that to the man who only has a hammer, everything looks like a nail, which means if your only tool, the only thing you bring to the game is a hammer, the only thing you know how to do is bang something. We need to be people who have more tools than one single tool. We didn't talk about this. We've said that it's appropriate, it would have been better for Job's friends to ask questions, and that we don't want to be the kinds of friends who just assume we know what's going on. That's not just because we could be like Job's friends. We could also miss, without asking questions, if our only category is Job-like suffering, we might miss when someone who is being chastised for sin and needs to hear a call to repentance. David with Bathsheba didn't need to be comforted the way that Job did. David needed to be confronted. You have broken the law of the Lord. Confess and repent or you will be destroyed. And if Nathan had come and spoken like a good Job comforter, he would have missed what David needed. So from either direction, we need to be able to be prepared to have the right tool to minister the word of the Lord in the right way. And one of the ways we do that is by thinking through and studying these different categories that the Lord gives us in his word for why believers suffer. Ready to turn to Proverbs then? All right. So, what we want to do here, I'm going to go a little more quickly over the sort of the background information, date and author, and those sorts of things, because I want us to focus on the structure of Proverbs and the purpose of that structure. So, date and author, just kind of the background things you need to know. When you read verse 1, it would seem like the question of the author of Proverbs is quite simple. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. However, as we keep reading, we see in 10:1, I have this on your outline, a section that begins with the Proverbs of Solomon. Then 25:1 begins with these words, "These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied." And then 31 begins with the words of Agur, son of Jakeh, the oracle. And then 31:1 begins with the words of King Lemuel, an oracle that his mother taught him. So while the beginning clearly relates Proverbs to Solomon, if you read through the whole book, there are different authors and there is a collected work that goes beyond the pen of Solomon himself. That statement about the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied, that points to a later date in redemptive history for the final editing and compiling is usually the word the commentators use. In other words, drawing this book into its final form. So I think the safest way, there are different opinions on, okay, when do we exactly date the last words of the book? When's the final shape take place? And the short answer is no one has a exact answer to that. I think the best way to say it is when we read Kings and Chronicles and the account of Solomon, he is clearly the wise king of Israel in a unique way. So he begins and is the heart of the wisdom movement, the wisdom tradition in Israel. But that tradition continues beyond him, and there's someone later on who has compiled the Proverbs of Solomon and added those two oracles at the end from figures that we know nothing about, Agur and King Lemuel, and even King Lemuel's mother. She teaches him something that he writes down, and it makes its way into the book, and they're compiled in final form at some point later, but the whole project, the whole book is associated with Solomon, and large portions of it are written by Solomon. So does that make sense? Is Proverbs written or is it spoken? I think the answer is actually both. It appears to be, we'll look at some of these hints as we go through, there appears to be both a tradition of passing down this kind of wisdom orally, but in the text of Proverbs as we have it, there's a careful literary structure that develops. So probably whoever that final editor was compiling this book in the way that Solomon taught the people of Israel, compiles it in the written form is also careful. And we'll see that even in the introduction. It speaks both of the words of the wise, but the particular forms and ways that wisdom is taught in a written document. So short answer is originally it was probably both. It was probably something that was spoken in the context of Israel, but what we have is a literary document, and both the beginning of Proverbs and actually the end of Ecclesiastes indicate that one of the things the wise man in Israel did was write words and give attention to written instruction. So it's both. There's an oral component, but we're going to give our attention to the written form of that. And the text of Proverbs itself says that that's one of the ways that wisdom is passed on, through careful writings. That's a great question, and it's one of the ways I want to go thinking about the structure. So I'll give you a short answer now, and then that's kind of the main question that's going to guide how we read the whole book. The question is, there are some criticisms, and Proverbs, for historical critical scholars, Proverbs is the book that they love to condemn. They talk about Proverbs being shallow, being simple, naive, having contradictions even in the between the Proverbs, because the assumption is that someone just compiled these all, never paying attention to the fact that some Proverbs appear to say one thing and another proverb says something different. So they point to contradictions in the book and argue that it's it's sloppily edited and it doesn't have a very good theology. I think that instinct, that skepticism about Proverbs, actually, even in light of the introduction, which we'll read in a moment, shows a foolish heart and not a wise heart. And Proverbs itself is written in a way that trains us to grow in wisdom even as we read it and wrestle with those complexities. So rather than being those apparent contradictions, just so we know what we're talking about, turn to Proverbs 26. This is the classic description. It is, I think it's 26, 26 verse 4 and 5. Someone read those two verses, two proverbs that are side by side. Someone read those and we'll talk about why. So a critical scholar will say, look, the editor didn't even notice that he put two proverbs side by side that contradict each other. Why would some people read that and say it's a contradiction? The first proverb says, what should we do for a fool? Don't answer, and then what does the next proverb say? So how would you explain that? What do you think? Is that a contradiction, or is there something different going on? It's a question of which, you notice the difference is in the second part of the parallel line. The reason you shouldn't answer a fool according to his folly is lest you become like him. The reason you should answer a fool is because you don't want him to be wise in his own eyes. But that's describing situations that it takes wisdom to know which one am I dealing with. Is this a case where if I start arguing with this person, the only result is that I will become more foolish by entering into the conversation? Or is this a case where this person needs to be contradicted because he thinks he's wise in his own eyes and someone needs to expose his folly? I'll give you an example. I am aware of a man, a former man in ministry, who has concluded in his pride and in his isolation, he was removed from ministry and rightly removed for sins and failures. He has concluded that he is the only person, he's never said this directly, but it's obvious. He basically believes he's the only person who sees things rightly, and he spends his life writing and accusing every other pastor, believer, leader he can think of failing in some way. The Proverbs tells you he is a fool. And anyone who enters into interaction with him, he's not open to reason. As soon as you email him or speak to him or interact with him, the only result is that he uses that as another reason to speak about how wise he is, how right he is, and how wrong everybody else is. That kind of person just needs to be ignored. They're not worthy of an answer. It's not going to change anything. God will deal with him. And the only result, if you think you can persuade him, is you're going to be drawn into a pointless argument that either will end quickly because you realize I can't say anything, or you'll end up becoming like him and having to accuse him back. And it's like, even though most of the interactions I've seen with him take place by email or online, it's like we begin shouting at each other and the volume rises and rises, and that's not profitable. That's the verse 4. Don't answer that fool according to his folly. You'll become like him. Ignore him. I can think of another case, though, where there is a man who I'm still praying the Lord saves, have interactions with. He's not a believer. He's a avowed atheist and communist. And his attitude towards Christians was that Christians were dumb and shallow and had never thought about the things he had thought about. And he tended to just be dismissive of Christianity. And another believer in my church and I have gotten to know him, and I think the Lord has given us both in different ways opportunities to challenge him and say, we actually have thought about that accusation you make, and there's actually a good answer. And to this man's credit, even though he has not come to faith, he has acknowledged, you're right, that's actually a pretty good answer. I have never thought of that. And he told both of us one day that my other friend Joe, who's a believer, we were in his office together, and this other man walked in and he said, you know what? Whenever somebody says now that evangelicals are shallow and stupid, I know it's not always true because I've met you guys. Now, I was humbled and honored that he would say that. I pray that the Lord continues to save him. I think that's the verse 5 situation where no one had ever confronted him. And so in his eyes, he thought he was wise and he was the person who was seeing through all of Christianity. And to his credit, I pray that that's common grace leading to saving grace, when someone challenged him respectfully and humbly but said, there's actually a good biblical answer for that argument you're raising against Christianity. Instead of adding to his folly, he was able to admit, I was wrong. There's more to it. He's not persuaded and he hasn't come to faith yet, but had we let him go on unchallenged, I think he would have grown more and more wise in his own eyes and convinced that Christians were too timid or too dumb to answer him. And he just needed someone to humbly say, there's actually a response to what you've just asked. Do you want to hear it? Let me share with you. You see how those are two different situations, and whereas you could read verses 4 and 5 and say, that's a contradiction. The editor missed that he put two Proverbs side by side. That would actually, if we said that would actually show we're foolish. We're not reading Proverbs carefully. Does that make sense? That kind of thing is exactly what we have to think about as we wrestle with Proverbs. I think the answer we've given is the basic pattern we'll use for how we answer that objection in general. But I want us to work through it and pay attention to some careful details. So what we've said, the basic background I want us to know, Proverbs as a book is associated with Solomon, and probably the majority of it is actually written by Solomon. We know from 1 Kings, Solomon wrote numerous Proverbs, but we have evidence in the text itself saying there are other authors who have been included, and there are collections that have been gathered at later points. So that makes dating the book a little challenging, but we don't really have to put an exact date on it. It's clearly a book about the concept and topic of wisdom, and that's what we're going to get to in a minute. But let's read verses 1 through 7 together, and then we'll talk about the structure and vocabulary of wisdom. So someone read just the opening, Proverbs 1 through 7 for us. It's called the prologue. We'll look at the structure in a minute. So this is one of those helpful places where the book actually tells us what it's intending to do. So what are some of the things, what is this book about? It says, it gives you an infinitive. I think you were learning those in Greek yesterday, a to verb. What does it say it's intended to do? So we've got the beginning infinitives, wisdom, instruction, but it's leading to the key theme, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Note that parallelism, two different concepts. This is where wisdom comes from. This is how fools relate to knowledge and instruction. The implication being fools obviously do not fear the Lord. Who are the people that it's addressed to? What kinds of people in that description? It's giving wisdom and instruction, understanding, instruction and wise dealing. But who are the people that are addressed? The simple, yep. To give prudence to the simple. And then who else? The wise, yeah. So simple is paired with youth. They're kind of, we'll talk about, those are probably the same category. The simple in Proverbs appears to be the young person who is not yet committed and could go either on the path of folly or on the path of wisdom. And Proverbs is calling to that simple person, hear the voice of wisdom and respond. So youth and simple are probably this parallel there. But the other category is the wise. So Proverbs, rather than being a book that is only about teaching kindergarten level instruction, it says it will train the simple, yet it's also there to speak to the wise. And what does it say the wise will receive from reading this book? Yeah, they will increase in learning, and they will understand and obtain guidance. Then notice verse 6. What does verse 6 say this book will teach us to be able to do? Yeah, to understand what? Note that specifically. The words of the wise and their riddles. We'll talk about each of those. This is pointing to the form that wisdom literature takes. And he's describing, in a moment, I'm going to look at kind of the vocabulary that we'll need to see in Proverbs. But the fact that the very beginning of the book says this is not just for the simple. It is a book that calls the simple to commitment to wisdom, and yet it also is a book addressed to the wise to give them learning and understanding, but also to help the wise understand these 4 different categories, different ways that wisdom is taught. A proverb, a saying, the words of the wise, and their riddles, especially riddles. One of the questions we'll see when we look at that, it's not clear. In other places in the Old Testament, that word points to what we would describe as a riddle. So when Samson poses the question about the honey and the lion, and puts it in the form of a riddle. It's the same word. Scholars look at this and say, well, Proverbs doesn't contain any riddles exactly like that, where it's a puzzle you have to figure out. But I think the implication is the form that this book is going to take, the kinds of learning we're going to get from it, are going to require us to think carefully. It's not going to be obvious on the surface, like a riddle that forces you to go deep and think, what is the meaning of that question or that way of phrasing it? Proverbs is going to force us to grapple and go deep, and the implication is you could read it in a shallow way and not receive wisdom. You could read it in a way that actually shows you have a foolish heart. And I'm going to argue that that's what those critical scholars who say, look at all these contradictions, in light of the prologue we just read, I think the verdict of Proverbs would be, if you read this and come away and think Proverbs is simple, it shows you're a fool. You're not someone who understands the riddles of the wise. You haven't thought deeply about it. You've already passed judgment in your heart on whether it is a wise book or a foolish book, and so you are revealing your heart by the way you read Proverbs. Does that make sense? So careful attention to what the prologue says it's going to do sets us up for a faithful reading of the book. Now, look, I've got this, put this up here so we can look at it together. Here's the structure of Proverbs. I've got a more detailed one there on the top. So this first table up here, 1 through 7 is the prologue. From there, verse 8 of chapter 1, all the way to the end of chapter 9, verse 18, is a series of exhortations, lessons, calls that usually begin with "my son, hear, listen," that sort of thing. Then at the beginning of chapter 10, we enter the section where it's the traditional Proverbs that we're familiar with. We go through there. There's another collection called the Words of the Wise in Proverbs 22. There's the Proverbs of Solomon compiled by Hezekiah. That begins in 25. And then those two oracles at the end, chapter 30 and chapter 31, that have different authors. What I want you to focus more on, though, is this second one. So in rough outline, not looking at all those details, we can divide Proverbs up into kind of 4 sections. There's the introduction, Proverbs 1 through 9, that's those exhortations to the son. Then there is what I'm calling beginning instruction in the path of wisdom, chapters 10 through 15. There's a subtle change that we'll look at beginning in chapter 16 and going all the way to chapter 31, verse 9, where we're advancing in the path of wisdom. And then we have the conclusion, this final acrostic poem celebrating the wise wife. And that ends the book. Most of the book is addressed to the son, and yet the book ends praising a woman, the wise wife, which she's often called, the Proverbs 31 woman, the description of godliness. That ends the book. And that rough structure of a call to commitment, Proverbs 1 through 9, commit yourself to wisdom, don't follow folly, then beginning instruction, then advancing instruction, and then that final poem. That's going to be the literary structure we work with. Does that make sense? So I'm going to keep that up there as we go through so that we can kind of reference that, and our way of walking through the book will be following themes through that rough structure. I think it'll make more sense as we get into that. I have a section there on wisdom in the ancient Near East. Are you guys aware of any of those categories from reading commentaries? Or the basic takeaway is that in the last century, there have been discoveries of a number of other ancient Near Eastern documents that are similar to Proverbs and reveal that the concerns that Proverbs has about wisdom were not unique to Israel. Egypt especially was famous for wisdom sayings, proverbial literature, this kind of thing. But I have there some quotes and some summaries of numerous other parallels. The conclusion from that, though, is not that Proverbs is not unique, because what stands out, even though there's similarities in some of the Proverbs themselves, what's absolutely unique is the theme that we'll see regularly through Proverbs. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs will tell us you can understand a proverb with a lowercase p, just a saying, but if you don't have the fear of the Lord, you are not a wise man. For all the similarities, and critical scholars will say, look, because there's this the sayings of the wise in Egyptian literature, Israel's wisdom is not unique. But that is also a foolish reading of Proverbs. The fact that the fear of the Lord, Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel who redeemed his people out of Egypt, the fact that that is the beginning of wisdom sets Israel's wisdom, our wisdom, on a very different foundation than those ancient Near Eastern parallels. So I just want to raise that, because if you encounter a commentary saying something like, this is not unique to Israel, you should ask them questions so that they won't be wise in their own eyes. Yeah, maybe this proverb is similar. They're, basic Proverbs instructions. We'll see some of those. But Proverbs doesn't just say you can get wisdom just by understanding those Proverbs. You have to begin with the fear of the Lord. And the book itself is going to teach us how to do that. That makes sense? Any questions on that? I don't want to go in depth on that, but it's a category you need to know about when you read Proverbs, ancient Near Eastern parallels. To work our way through the structure, what we're going to do is reading Proverbs carefully. So I have there, it's page 4, Proverbs, capital P, and Proverbs, lowercase p. That's the distinction is that, when we read something like, a false witness will not go unpunished, and he who breathes out lies will perish. That's chapter 19, verse 9. That's a proverb. But Proverbs itself, as a book, has a integrity and a unity of its own. So to read the individual Proverbs right, we have to understand the book right. And to do that, we're going to have to grapple with this kind of what I'm calling wisdom vocabulary, because we'll see lots of different words that are, I don't think we should make a massive distinction between them. But part of what they're pointing to is that wisdom is not a simple concept. So let's look at that. I'm quoting a couple different scholars. We're going to follow a guy named Derek Kidner, who is one of the best Old Testament commentators. Hopefully you have some of his books over there. If not, anytime you see a commentary by Derek Kidner, it is worth reading. He is a very insightful and faithful reader of the Old Testament. So it's actually going to be on page 5. I'm following him. He's talking about these 5 groups of words that show up there. So first we have instruction. In verse 3, to receive instruction. The Hebrew is musar, and it's usually, it has the sense of reproof or rebuke. It's instruction that often comes in the form of correcting something that's wrong. It's often associated with another word, tokat, that is more directly a rebuke. The idea is that the kind of instruction that we receive, it is correcting us and pointing us in the right way, and we're not naturally pointed in the right way. So there's that category, instruction that redirects our lives. The next one is understanding or insight. Bina or tabuna are the Hebrew verbs, or Hebrew nouns, when he says to understand words of insight. Usually what that means, it's the idea of distinguishing between two things. So insight, in broad strokes, and you have to analyze each use of the word to see what exact nuance, but in general, to be a person of insight is to be someone who can look at the options and understand the differences between them, and then evaluate which one is the most faithful choice. So Proverbs is trying to make you the kind of person who can look at life and understand, to use that example, everything is not a nail, and I need to have more tools than a hammer, and I need to be able to look and think, what is needed in this case? That's the gift, the character trait of insight, distinguishing between options. And that's one of the things that Proverbs gives us. Then wise dealing, so when it says to know wisdom, instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, the verb form and the nouns are all related to, the verb form is sakal, and it usually means someone who has good sense, someone who is a person, in America we might say, someone they have common sense. In other words, they're not a foolish person. They don't make dumb mistakes. It's probably easier to give examples. Remember the story of Abigail in the narrative of Samuel? When Abigail comes, David is ready to kill Naboth because of his insult, and he comes, he brings his warriors, and he is coming to slay this fool. And Abigail comes out and stops him and convinces him that he shouldn't take vengeance in his own hands, that the Lord will take care of him, And as the story unfolds, she's exactly right. Nabal, whose name literally means fool in Hebrew, the man named Fool dies the death of a fool, and God kills him for his insult against the king. But Abigail is described as a woman of good sense, insight, sakal. She is showing that trait as she uses wise words. She knows how to calm the wrath of the king and slow David down and cause him to think. And she provides an example of someone who has that ability to understand the situation and know what's needed to preserve David from making a foolish mistake. That's the kind of trait that is in mind, the kind of virtue behind the phrase wise dealing. It's good sense. It's that a kind of person that you trust because they sort out the situation, they weigh it carefully, and they're going to make a good choice. I can think of the difference in a church setting, and you don't have to be in leadership very long to have this sense. There will be certain people that you think, if I couldn't be there on a Sunday, if I had to hand a part of Sunday worship over, that person, and I'm not pointing at anybody in general, but imagine, that person, I would feel confident. They could handle it. That person, I am not going to give the mic to because I don't know what's going to come out of their mouth when they stand in front of people and have a chance to talk. They don't have good sense. That person does have good sense. I bet you can probably think of the distinction. We laugh in our church that there are people that, it's kind of funny, especially when a guest speaker comes in. There are people that will go up to talk to the guest speaker who are going to be a blessing and encouragement. And then there are just a few people that as pastors, we kind of keep our eye out because whenever they go to the guest speaker, they're going to talk to him forever. They're going to share things that are not appropriate. And somebody's going to have to rescue the guest speaker from that person because they don't have good sense. You'll learn someone just has the quality. They are someone who has walked with the Lord enough. They understand life. They know, they have good sense. And Proverbs is going to give us that kind of sense. And you'll know when someone doesn't have it, whether it's that exact form I talked about or whether it's something else. You'll just, all right, I love them, I want to care for them, but they're probably not the person I'm going to trust to be up front, taking some kind of lead. They just don't have the sense to know what's appropriate and what's not. The next two, after wise dealing, we have knowledge and discretion. Let me look at the Hebrew because it's kind of a complicated sentence. It says to give to the simple arma, which is it's in medzima, into verse 4, prudence and discretion and knowledge, all the things that are lumped in to give to the simple. I think it's medzima, which is translated in the ESV as, I think that's what they're translating, discretion. It's actually the same term that is used of the serpent when it says the serpent was crafty in Genesis 3. It's often a negative sense, but here in Proverbs it has more the sense of someone who can plan and think through, not just have an idea but have no idea how to bring it about, but someone who can think through all that it's going to take to make something happen. It's that, again, it's a quality of someone that makes them trustworthy because you recognize they're not only going to say, that's great, let's do it. How? I have no idea. They're going to be able to have the discernment, the discretion, the prudence to put these things together and understand what does it take to make this happen. That's one of the things that Proverbs imparts. Then the last category, two kind of parallel phrases, knowledge and learning. Da'at and lakah are the Hebrew terms. Knowledge, it's not just intellectual knowledge. It is knowing the way the world works. So, my friend that I referenced does not understand what's appropriate and not. He lacks knowledge of what's the right way to enter into a conversation and what's not. Proverbs is giving you that knowledge of, and interestingly, it'll say, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of da'at, of knowledge. Beginning with the Lord, you start to understand the world that the Lord has made and how to live in it. All those are kinds of vocabulary words that we're going to see over and over in Proverbs. Now, back to James's question, it's not that we make massive distinctions between these and say they're completely different things. It's rather, Proverbs is using this different vocabulary to paint us a complex picture of one person. Thank you. We'll break in a minute. We'll get our coffee together. We'll pause it after this. You guys know the idea of a prism reflecting light? You know, when you shine light and it hits a prism, a certain kind of glass, it breaks it apart into the different parts. That's how you can use a prism and shine a rainbow, break the light into the rainbow. It's like Proverbs is doing that with the person it's trying to make us become. So it's not that you're to read these and think, well, I'll take some wisdom and I'll have a little bit of knowledge. That's what I want out of the book. You don't pick and choose. All these are one quality of the kind of descriptions from different angles of the kind of person Proverbs wants to make us. But we can separate them out and think about it as a way of growing in depth in wisdom and learning all the attributes that make up this kind of person. Does that make sense? So we'll see there's a basic distinction in Proverbs, two categories that we can describe in different ways. The basic distinction is the wise or the foolish, or parallel with that, the righteous or the wicked. The wicked do not have these qualities. The foolish do not have these qualities. The wise and the righteous do. And Proverbs is trying to make us those kind of people. It's like the prism that Proverbs is shining through is it's wisdom, and let's break it down into all the different aspects. You can't be a wise person without possessing these character traits and these virtues. And together they make up the person that Proverbs wants us to become. Yeah, the wise person, who was also a righteous person. We'll see that too. They're parallel concepts. Sometimes it'll say the righteous do this, but the wicked do this. Sometimes it will say the wise do this, but the foolish. It's not describing, you can't decide, I want to be a wise person, but I don't want to be righteous. They're all lumped together into one picture of what a faithful person living out the covenant and the fear of the Lord, what that person looks like, and breaking it apart so that we can reflect on it and think, how do I need to pursue knowledge and instruction and insight, these kind of things. But then when we apply it, we back up and say, we're meant to be all of this. Or what Paul says in another concept, we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. It's not as though to be a Christian is to have no idea about evil and to be completely clueless and naive about the evil of the world. But we're not to love evil. We're to hate it and turn away, but we're to be wise. Satan has devices. Folly is real. It's that kind of thing. And in that context, actually, in Matthew, one of the things we'll see is there's a way in which we can say Jesus is the ultimate wise man who is imparting the fullness of wisdom to us because he is wisdom incarnate and he is giving that to his followers. And kinds of sayings like that are places where scholars will look and say, one way of reading the Gospels is to look at Jesus as the sage who is teaching us true wisdom, using the forms of wisdom, proverbs, and riddles and parables to pass on wisdom. I can't say that without saying, I think one of the ways to read Proverbs in biblical theological context is that it's the book of Solomon, who is the king who for a moment presides over the golden age of Israel because the favor of the Lord is upon him. And yet the irony is that Solomon, the wise king, becomes foolish and falls, and the kingdom falls with him. In that he is a pointer by contrast to the king who is completely wise and whose kingdom prospers and enters the perfect golden age because he never falls and never succumbs to folly. That theme of wisdom and folly in Christ as the king whose wisdom changes the whole community, I think that'll affect how we read Proverbs. Yeah, like is Proverbs one of the ways that we become that kind of person who's wise as a serpent but innocent as a dove? Yeah, I think so. I think that's in some ways Jesus capturing in a proverb the heart of Old Testament wisdom, the goal to be that kind of person. Sometimes you will encounter people who think that to be a pastor means you know nothing about the dark side. You just spend your days in nice, happy thoughts, and you don't have to be a pastor very long to realize, no, that's not quite it. To be a pastor is to be very well aware of the ways that sin breaks and destroys human lives. But we should never let that make us compromise with sin. Yeah. So we are innocent as doves by hating that, but wise to know, there are many ways that sin could destroy us. You guys are making the perfect parallels with the gospel. This is exactly how we're to be thinking. I think what Jesus is saying there, it's a challenging proverb or parable because The person he commends, you remember the story, he commends someone who's cheating his employer. But the point is not to commend dishonesty. The point is this wasn't, someone to, if I can riff on the proverb or the parable, this wasn't someone who just grabbed all the money and ran out the door with money flopping out, falling out of his hands and running, just hoping he gets away. He gave thought to it. He knew exactly how he was going to plan it. It was a well-laid scheme. Even though it was dishonest and evil, it was a well-thought-out attempt. One of the things in American films, there's kind of a theme in American films, what we call a heist movie, where it's all about somebody robbing someone. We watched one of those with family recently, and it's like I found myself saying to my 8-year-old son, you realize there are no good guys in this movie. Everybody's a bad guy, and I can't commend anybody. And part of me is thinking, why am I watching this movie? Maybe this is not a good thing to be doing. But what draws you in is that they are conning someone in a very clever way. And I think what Jesus is pointing at is, how sad is it if those who are committed to evil are doing a better job at doing evil things than those who are committed to light are at pursuing the purposes of the kingdom of God. So Proverbs should make us the kind of person that is wise, is carefully thinking through, what does it take to be the person that I'm called to be in my circles? And the contrast that Jesus draws is, how sad would it be if the sons of light are so shallow in the way they think about and have such a small grasp of how the world works that they can't actually accomplish the good deeds that they want to do. So the one point of commendation is not the dishonesty, but this was well thought out. And Proverbs I think that's the implication of that, using a word that's normally negative as something it's intended to give, saying, if by sin's nature we're really good at sinning, wisdom calls us to become really good and wise about doing good. To think of the parallel with Job, so when Job is describing his stature before, it's royal language and it's also wisdom language. Job was not a man who had good intentions but had no idea how to accomplish them. He was a man who had all these qualities so that he could do much good. Proverbs wants us to be that kind of person. Critical scholars will say Job critiques and even condemns Proverbs. The message of Job, whoever the author of Job was, read Proverbs and thought it was simplistic and not true, and he is writing his book to critique it. What I'm going to argue is that the friends represent a simplistic, shallow way of reading the book of Proverbs. That in light of the prologue that we just read, that not only says it's giving prudence to the simple, but says even the wise will understand and increase in learning and know how to interpret Proverbs. Proverbs itself is signaling to us there is more going on. But Proverbs itself is also saying the picture's complex, but not because good and evil are really kind of two different sides of the same coin. So there's a way, it's more in sort of an Eastern, Far Eastern, religions like Buddhism or Hinduism, some of an Eastern way of looking at the world, which is in some ways impacting the West. There's this idea that if you go deep enough, good and evil are really sort of the same thing. They appear to be different, but darkness and light are two different sides of the same coin. You guys know the yin and yang symbol? And the basic interpretation of that is that the balance must be, good and evil, which is a Star Wars sort of thing. George Lucas was steeped in this Eastern vision. Part of what Proverbs is doing, this is where we're going to go as we read the structure. Proverbs starts by making absolutely clear that is false. Wisdom and folly are absolutely opposed, and you must commit yourself to one or the other. There is no complexity in the fact that righteousness and wickedness have no fellowship together. Chapters 1 through 9 are all hammering that message to call us to ultimate allegiance. You must choose. Will you listen to wisdom or folly? And it's not that they're mixed and need to be balanced. But once we've made that commitment, as we get into chapter 10 and following on, Proverbs is going to say, okay, now that you have made your ultimate commitment and you are pursuing wisdom, fearing the Lord, turning away from evil, It is a complex world that we live in. And it will begin to nuance the picture by saying, it's not quite as simple as Job's friends. They understand the difference between good and evil, but they haven't reflected on the way that Proverbs disciples us in the way of wisdom, to learn to recognize the complexities of the world, while at the same time saying good and evil are fundamentally opposed. You can't be both darkness and light, but the sons of light live in a dark world and will have to have a very deep wisdom to live in that world faithfully. Does that make sense? That's where we're going to go. That's exactly the question to think about as we read through the structure of Proverbs.